we get so last week, if you remember, we did a overview of the processes of psak and the unique challenges they face in sort of new questions that come up. So, like I said, in general, I'm open to suggestions. But for this week, I figured, first of all, I know, as I've heard from several people are sick of thinking and talking about coronavirus. So, as much as there's good material that's coming up in coronavirus, I'm not going to over-inundate you with just the newest things that are coming up. But I think if we don't do some, that'd probably be a shame. This one is tangentially involved to it, but as you can see from the title, the reason that I put this together was really, I put this together for myself before I named my twins 2 weeks ago, a week ago, whenever I named them, whenever that was. They were born 2 weeks ago, whenever I named them, and did a family naming on Zoom, and people, including friends and parents or whatever, asked me, well, why are you doing that? Aren't you supposed to do it in shul? Aren't you supposed to name them when you get an Aliyah? And amongst the low-stakes questions that have been asked in the coronavirus, this is one of them, and I figured I would just give this as a share now that I sort of thought it through for myself. Though I do think because it is so low stakes, first of all, we won't be talking too much about coronavirus, right? I feel like it's a bit heavy every time I do like the triage chuvot of triaging ventilators and things like that. That's a bit much for me. I'm not in the mood to do that right now. But it is important to realize that any radical shift or any big change is going to have major implications on halacha, and a lot of the coronavirus shilas are really depressing and extreme. Triage with ventilators, tshuva for someone who accidentally spread, who was a non-symptomatic carrier, who accidentally spread it in nursing home and led to somebody's death, right? These are like the intense shilas that have been written. But there are also very small questions that come up, but they also get affected by it because, very simply put, halacha lema'aseh, practical law, is the meeting of theoretical law and reality. So when reality changes, any possible area of halacha that can be affected by it will be affected by it. So I want to use this, which is again I think a low stakes one, and I was thinking about it in a happy context over the last few weeks. I wanted to share it with you. I guess in honor of my daughters. It's also been a while. We have 3 boys, so there's a special simcha when you finally get to. Yeah, I have 3 older boys. Tmima and Ayala. If we have time, I'll explain to you the names. I guess at the end. But I want to talk about the halachic issue here. It was actually also, besides for it being what's on my mind and having simcha attached to it for me, it was also the first shaila I actually got during the coronavirus world that was affected by corona. Happened to be the shaila. So I had started looking at it a few months ago when someone asked me the question, and while I am definitely not at the pay grade that I want triage questions, the question of how to name daughters when you can't travel and whether you can do it on Zoom, that's about my pay grade of psak, so I was happy to do it. So before we look at sources, I've already implied that this shaila is low stakes, but what do you think? Is this even a halachic question? Right? What type of question is it? Right? Of how do you name daughters when you maybe can't go to shul, maybe you don't want to go to shul because you're scared, or you dafka want to name them on Zoom because your family can't travel because airports have been closed for months on end. How? Right? What do you do? Right? You're asked the question. I was asked this question, right? 6 months ago. What do you do? Where do you even look? Right? Again, classically, when people name daughters, it's usually in shul. They get the father gets an aliyah, names the daughter, says a mishaberach. That's it. Now, that's not realistic, not possible, or you have reason to not do it. So, where do you look? What do you even do? What do you got to figure out? What do you do? Right? I want you to start thinking like a halachist. What do you do? It's a slightly new scenario, right? It prevents people from doing what they would normally do, going to shul. So So what do you do? Where do you look? How do you figure it out? It's two papers. Yeah. What do you do? You're the posek. Think. What do you do?
Where do you look? You look in the shulchan or no?
Okay. So first you gotta let's broaden it, but you're correct. First thing you gotta figure out is, well, look at the source. Meaning, when you say look at Shulchan Aruch, you don't necessarily mean look at Shulchan Aruch per se. What do you really mean?
Okay.
I mean, that is a good place to look, but what do you mean? First you gotta figure out, right, what do you gotta do? You figure out, we have a given. Most people name their daughters when they in shul, when they get an Aliyah. So what do you got to figure out if you want to figure out whether you're allowed to do that? Not that way. Or if you're allowed to do it not in shul, on Zoom. What do you got to figure out? So you have to look at Shulchan Aruch, but why? What are you looking for?
Looking for like a source that I do.
Yeah, you got to figure out why you do what you do. Right? If you want to change, right, you want to not go to shul, not get an Aliyah, not be within, 6 feet of someone in shul or even in an outdoor minyan, right? And you want your parents and sister and brother and all the uncles and aunts and whatever to be able to join no matter where they are in the world. So you don't want to go to shul. So you got to figure out, well, why do we normally do what we do? And when you do that, you got to figure out, is it halacha? Is it minhag? If it's halacha, how hard is it to change? Well, harder. If it's minhag, less hard. And if it's a minhag, it still depends. How old of a minhag? How well established of a minhag? Right? Even within minhagim, there are levels, right? Whenever you want to change something, you've got to figure out, well, why do we do what we do? And often it's when the world changes that you bother even asking, why do we do what we do? Right? So this is really where the question starts. So before we get to girls, let's start with boys for a second. That I have a lot more experience with. This was new for me. Boys. When do we traditionally name boys? Bris. Good. And the Bris. Is that halacha or minhag? Okay, let's get vote. Halacha. Minhag. Okay, the answer is minhag. Ah, very good. Minhag. But how old is the minhag? How old is the minhag?
Pretty recent.
So boys is really, really old. Really old. But I want to show you something fascinating, okay? Look at number 1 here. This is a summary from the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. Major posek, he died in 2006. My Shana Aleph, I remember he passed away. It was like Erev Chag or something. It was very, very stressful. Like, it was very hard to actually go to the funeral because it was... Anyways, he was one of the leading poskim in medical ethics. He was the de facto, though not actually technical, posek of Shari Tzedek for many years. So he was asked about the naming of boys and girls. So first let's just talk about boys. So he says, right, he was asked, Hatam shekorim shem leben ano lebishad milav lefneken. Why do you name boys at the bris and not after, not before rather? And batay yesh lekrot shem lebat and yesh ledak lekrot shem im kriyat Torah. And when do you name your daughters, and does it have to be in shuls? So first, if you skip down to where it says Aleph, right, he's entering a Rav Avram Meshi Zahav. I don't know who that is. He says, She'elat Rishona. Your first question, why do we name boys at the bris? That was most people don't name their boys until the bris. Now this gets very complicated, by the way. Right? Because if you thought this was halacha, so in Israel it's actually easy. Right? In Israel the given is you don't name your boy till the bris, and the government understands that. In America, it's a bit complicated to do that. Why? Because when, please God, you have your first children and you are in the hospital, what are they going to do within like 12 hours? Yes, they're going to need a name because they got to fill it out so you can get social security number, so you can get citizenship, all that stuff. And you don't get a name until the bris. Right? So what are you going to do? So, you can either decide, well, halachically, you're allowed to name before the bris, so just give them a name. Or writing it for a secular document, their English name, that doesn't count, that's okay, right? Or, if you really want to be clever, one of my friends said the trick is, if you give in the form without the name, they don't check in the hospital, they just submit it to the government. And if the government sees there's a name, they'll mail it back to you to do it later, because if you submit it later, it's a change, right? And then you have to pay money, because you don't have to pay money when you submit it, but a change costs money. But if you put it without the name, they'll send it to you for free for correction, assuming that it was a mistake, right? And then you have a few weeks and you're fine. So if you want to do that, mato. But whether you have to do that comes down to whether this is halacha or minhag and what's the status of an English name and things like that. So for my oldest son, we put his English name on his birth certificate before his bris. That was in America. My second son was in Israel, and we were moving to Canada for a few years, 3 weeks after he was born, so we actually got him a passport before his bris, which was very stressful, so we had to give him a name also. But we refrained from actually using the name because of, well, this, as we'll see, minhag. So Tzitz Eliezer says, where did minhag come from? Tshuva, Yesh davar hazeh shelo l'kro b'shem haben hanolad l'fnei brit hamilah mikorot namanim. He says, this is a very old minhag. Yuyan b'sefer klalei hamilah l'Rabbi Yaakov HaGozer chai l'fnei l'mala mishra me'ot shana. So the first source he quotes is 700 years ago from Rabbi Yaakov HaGozer. Okay? Rabbi Yaakov HaGozer. What does HaGozer mean? HaGozer means someone who cuts. It was what they called a mohel, right? He was a mohel. He was the cutter, right? He was a mohel. So he wrote a book. Mevi minhag zeh. And he says, what's the source for this custom? The gam masbiro v'kotev deb'pnei ma tiknu likrot shem l'na'ar tekev lamilah mishum da'ad ata l'fnei hamilah hayeshem tuma lefanav v'charva shem arelut v'achshav shenimol v'kemu mitzvah milah tzarich l'shanot shmo l'shvach. He says the reason is because there was a certain impurity on him before, and you remove that when you give him a brit milah, and therefore his name is now, right, you give him a name when the impurity is gone. Uminole shetzarach l'shanot shmo b'shad hamilah she'ad lo malbar b'sor lato hayeh shmo Avram u'miyak shmo l'shanot shmo l'shvach u'nitozev lo ora achad v'nikra Abraham. And what's his proof? Where does he get this idea that you should change the name at the milah? Or give a name, yeah? Avram. Right, that Avram was Aleph, Vet, Resh, Mem, Avram, Abram, until his bris, and then he got an extra hay, and he was named Avraham with a hay. So you see that at the bris is a time to change the name. So, Rabbi Waldenberg knows that this custom goes back 700 years, and the source for the minhag, according to him, goes back to about as early as you can get. Now, from the Avram source, is that a good source? What do you think? Is it a good, firm halachic source? What do you think? So you would say, it's pretty good. There's a problem. Avram was renamed, at least at his bris. Except, how long did that minhag stay as the lived practice of the Abrahamic family? What? Yeah, it stopped with him. How do we know? Very good, thank you. Yitzchak was named before he was born. Right? God already said what Yitzchak's name was going to be. Right? So Avram got a different name at his bris, right? But Yitzchak was given his name before he was even born. Right? That was his name. So, as a firm halachic source, it's not. It's a minhag. It's an old minhag. It's an old minhag. And he quotes then the Rashmi, Garmaiza Mirabosov Sharashi. He says, okay, that's 700 years ago, but I got a better source from you, from the Rashmi Garmaiza, who's a Rebbe of Rashi. So now we're talking 1,000, almost 1,100 years ago. That's a pretty old minhag. It's a minhag, but it's a pretty old minhag. Okay? Who wrote, V'lama in Koran Shem Lenar Kim B'yom Milah, Lefi Shel Nikra Avram El Avram, Kim B'shad Milato, U'B'Seiter Matei Moshe, says it as well, and then he quotes in the Reben Yakar. So he notes that this is a well-established minhag in Ashkenazi, Sephardic communities, going back at least 1,000, 1,100 years. And he says, V'cheven la'azbir da'amur al pi derech ha'kabbalah b'zerech chesed la'avram. And then he says, Kabbalistically, it makes sense. Because shalachei nagu shal ikra lo shem rak achar milah b'mnei dechol od sheyesh lo achiza be'orla v'tumah yefshar she'ech orla v'neshama. Kabbalistically, the soul of the baby doesn't really enter fully until the bris, whatever that means. And that's why you say, right, he should call his name Yisrael, because before they doesn't have a shem in Yisrael. And therefore he says, he said, therefore this is a very old minhag. Right, at least 1,000 years old. Now, the Tzitz Eliezer is a pretty classic posek. But if you look at his next line, he writes, he found a reference in the Sefer Minhag Yeshurun who quotes another book, who claims that he knows that the minhag at least goes back to the time of the Second Temple. Now, the Tzitz Eliezer just quotes a Sefer Minhagim, and he says, I know, the earliest source I know for this is 1,000 years ago, but I know of a late minhag book who claims that he heard that the minhag goes back to the Second Temple period. Okay? The truth is that the Tzitz Eliezer, the best he can do to trace this minhag back 2,000 years is to quote a late book who quotes someone who says, I heard that it goes back 2,000 years. The truth is that we actually know, without a shadow of a doubt, that this custom goes back 2,000 years, except not in any Jewish source. But we have two very good sources. And that is, I gave it to you in the next source, Luke chapter 1 and Luke chapter 2 in the New Testament. We do know of two people who were named only at their bris, but their names are, they were Jewish when they were born, hence they had this minhag. And this may not be a Jewish theological text, but it is a good historical text. The names of those people are John the Baptist and Jesus, who are both named at their bris on the 8th day, which is evidence of the fact that this custom does indeed go back at least 2,000 years. So I gave you in 2 and 3, Luke chapter 1. You're like shocked I'm bringing this in a halacha share, but yes, this is as far back as I know that the custom goes. But in Luke chapter 1, when it comes to the birth of John the Baptist, you find out that when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah, but his mother spoke up and said, no, he is to be called John. And then in Luke chapter 2, on the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise the child, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he was conceived. So, in fact, it turns out that this minhag is very old. In traditional Jewish sources, we can trace it back about 1,000 years. But in non-traditional sources, which, at least in terms of their writing, we know they go back pretty far, we see that this was in fact the custom amongst Jewish people going back about 2,000 years at least. Okay? So naming boys at the bris is a pretty old minhag. Okay, it's a minhag. It is a minhag, surprisingly. I know we all think it's halacha, but it's a really, really, really old, well-established minhag. Okay. So if I asked you, how hard would it be to paskin that under this, for whatever reason, you would not name the boy at a bris, what would you say? How hard? I'd say, whatever. Like, it's a minhag, so like, if there were really, really pressing circumstances, I would say you could do it, but it's a pretty old minhag, so try not to do it. And that's why, like, when I had my kid, right, the psak that I got was, look, it's a minhag, so at the end of the day, you don't have to not fill out the birth certificate, right? You don't have to do that and cost yourself money to go fill out the birth certificate later and change the name. But, like, you should still try to keep the minhag. Like, don't give them their Jewish name, right? Don't start calling them. So write it on a secular paper, which doesn't mean anything for halachic purposes, so fine, give them their secular name, right? But you should try as much as possible to keep it, because it's a really old minhag, and we care about minhag. Okay. What about the minhag to name girls in shul when the father gets an aliyah? How old is that minhag? What? Yeah, much newer. Very good. But I want to show you, remember I said last week that there are some poskim who are very minhag-oriented? So, if you're not a minhag-oriented posek, so you would say, look, I give value to minhagim, but a minhag that goes back 2,000 years, that's a minhag that's, I have to really contend with. If a minhag is only 200-300 years old, it's a minhag. It's a newer minhag. If you're a real minhag posek, like if you're really a posek who gives a lot more weight to minhag, you'll see that those types of lines blur. So the Tzitz Eliezer often does give that type of weight to minhag. So if you continue back in that tshuva, he says, She'elato hashniya, hu be'inyan lateit shem lebat, sheyesh harbe minhagim bazeh. When it comes to naming girls, there are many different minhagim. Yesh minhagim b'sheni v'chamishi, some name at the first time you can read the Torah, to the Monday or Thursday. V'yesh minhagim b'Shabbat, some wait till Shabbat. V'hadmor, Rebbe Meir mi Amshinav, the Amshinav Rebbe, shal oto lifnei Harbe shanim linyan b'makor lefila atav charlatei shem labat takev and oldam adul lechakot at kriat Torah. The Amshinav said, I don't understand. Just name the baby when they're born. Name the girl when they're born. Shuvah. So the Tzitz Eliezer says, Gam l'davar zeh mikarot. No, this is also sourced. Now, does he really distinguish? He just says, no, they're both sourced. A minhag's a minhag. Right? A minhag's a minhag. And there are sources. And he says, B'sefer Tamei HaMinhagim Otzar Esko B'nyanei Mila, in the Tamei HaMinhagim, Katav Sheshama Mishem Arash Mibels. He heard from the Bells the Rebbe, Sha'amar She'im Nolda La'echad Bat, that if someone has a daughter, Ein Likrot L'Shem Kodem Chamisha Yamim. You should wait at least 5 days to name the baby. Unless V'yom HaShlishi Hu Shabbat Kodesh Yachol Likrot L'Shem Shabbat Kodesh. Unless it's Shabbat, and then you can name as soon as Shabbat comes. V'ani matzati tshuva achat me'agon bal darkei tshuva v'sevil kutei marza b'sofo. And I found the tshuva, the darkei tshuva, the kotev bazeh v'zel l'shono, v'asher sha'al al mi shenolad bat l'mazel tov, be'emtza shavuim l'kol Hashem tekef beit kriyat sefer Torah samuch, v'arishon olamtin al Shabbat Kodesh. Should you name the baby the first time you have an Aliyah, or should you wait till Shabbat? Hinei shamati b'shem Kvodo, Zekeni, Agon, etc. Rabbeinu, Marza, Zecher, Tzadik, L'chai Olam Haba, Baal B'nei Yissaschar, She'etziru L'kol Hashem, take up the Kriyat Torah Samuch. The B'nei Yissaschar said, for some reason, when it's pronounced, it's not the normal way of Yisachar, but his name, the Hasidic rabbi, is the B'nei Yissaschar. I don't know why, but that's what it is. He says, on the first Monday, Thursday, There's something to do Kabbalistically with the Sefer Torah, and it's not about Shabbos, it's about Torah. And then he quotes in the next paragraph, Ken Ra'iti b'Sefer Otzar Kol Minhagi Yeshurun, Shemevi b'Shem Sefer Shulchan HaKriya, Shekotev Nami b'Chon HaAmor, the Tam Shekorin Shem Levad, Al Nod Be'et, Shekorin Ha'av Lalot B'Torah, he also says that it's about the Torah, that you name the baby with the Torah, so it's the first time you read the Torah. And therefore he says, based on this, so for both the boy and the girl, I find sources for this, and the hint to it is the following Drisha, which we'll look at in a minute. But what do you see, right? If we want to think methodologically about this, the Tzitz Eliezer, right? You can tell that he's the type of posek who gives minhag a lot of weight, because does he even bother weighing minhagim here, right? And say, even as I'm saying now, Bris, naming the boy to Bris, it's a minhag, but it goes back to at least 1,000 years, and we have external sources that goes back 2,000 years. It's an old minhag. You should give it a lot of weight. You should do what you can. It's not halacha, so you can play with it. Naming girls, as he says, well, the Hasidish Minhagim, the first time you read the Torah on Shabbos, 5 days unless it's Shabbos, right? Does he even bother saying, well, one's an early minhag, one's a late minhag? What does he do? Right? No. Right? He says there's minhag, there's sources, right? And that reveals something about the way he thinks, right? Is that he's a posek who takes minhag very seriously, and therefore these types of distinctions don't matter. Right, they don't matter so much. I mean, maybe push comes to shove, they matter. Right, but you already see that right, if there's a source to the minhag, then that's it, right? Oh, yesh mikarot, that word, that's it, right? He's happy. But for most poskim, right, they'll look at it and they'll say, wait. This question is a lower stakes question, because first of all, it's a minhag, which lowers the stakes. Second of all, even within minhagim, there are distinctions. There's old minhagim and there's relatively new minhagim. The absolutely earliest possible source that you can find for the minhag to name a girl, specifically when you get an Aliyah. So if you turn to 5 for a second, and this is what the Tzitz Eliezer hints at, but let's look at it inside, is the Drisha. So who's the Drisha? So the Drisha is a commentary on the Tur. Okay, his name is... Someone want to get a tour? Do you know where the tour is here? So if you get a tour, right, it's important to know these right names. I always do this in all my shiurim. Let's talk a little biography here, okay? So Tzitz Eliezer, as I mentioned, was a 20th century posek, died in 2006. Leading posek in medical ethics, lived in Yerushalayim, mostly in the Haredi world, though he also is a Zionist, wrote a Sefer Hilchot Medina, so a little bit of an interesting middle figure. the Drisha is a commentary on the Tur. The Tur is written by Rabbi Yaakov Bal HaTurim Ben Asher. His father is the Rush, right? So the Tur is the first. Right, the Rambam is like the major code, obviously, in the 12th century, but the Tur is the first one to divide up halacha as we have it now in Shulchan Aruch to 4 sections: Orach Chaim, Yerodei, Choshen Mishpat, and Even Ezer. Right, daily living, ritual law, marital law, financial matters. He lives in Spain. Right? He lives in Spain because his father starts in Germany and then moves. His father starts in the world of Balei Tosfos, moves over. Then there are commentaries on the Tur. The most important of the commentaries, almost definitely on the Tur, is
Sorry, what's the year?
what?
What's the year? The century of the Torah?
The Tur is 13th century. I'm pretty sure that's right. 13th century, right? And he's living in Spain. The most important commentary on the Tur is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, called the Beit Yosef, which is his encyclopedia on halacha, which in its abbreviated form becomes Shulchan Aruch. Right? That would be very important. The Rama, who's the Ashkenazi commentary, right, gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, also writes a commentary on the Tur called the Darkei Moshe. On our tours, we only have the abbreviated version, which is the Darkei Moshe HaKatzar, but he did at some point in his life choose not to publish his encyclopedic version because of the Beit Yosef's pre-existing version, called the Darkei Moshe HaAruch. But there was also a commentary, 2 commentaries, right, the Drisha and the Prisha, on the Tur, written by, now I feel bad, the person who went to get the Tur is not back, so I will wait. And like I said, right, the Tur divides up halacha into 4 sections, just like Shulchan Aruch, who follows him. And again, Orach Chaim is daily living, right? If you haven't gotten this, it's just a basic knowledge you should know. Yerodei is ritual law, which includes everything from kashrus to staka, kibbut aveim, nida, avelut, right? That's all in Yerodei. Choshen Mishpat is all monetary law. Even Ezer is marital law, right? So, right, it's much shorter. That's just, Kiddushin, Ketubah, Gittin, Purvu, things like that. Fine. Okay. We've lost several people, so. And what century is the Beit Yosef? Is it Yosef Karo? 16th century, right there. Yeah, he's 16th century. And where does he live? Mostly? Tzfat. Right? He lives in Tzfat. Okay, anything else there that we need to know? Okay, well, anyways, the Drisha, you can tell him to come in. It's okay. It seems to have disappeared. The Drisha and the Prisha are both written by Yoshua Falk Katz. And he is also 16th century, right? He's born, exact years are 1555 to 1614 in Poland. Okay, he's born in Poland, dies in Ukraine. So that general area, that's the Drisha. Okay, so we're talking now 16th century, contemporaneous, essentially Shulchan Aruch, a pretty early commentary as things go. Not super early. It's basically what we called like beginning of Achronim or something like that, 500 years, but still, somewhat old. So this is the first hint that we have of this custom. So the Drisha writes in 5, Nireh lefi da'ati, dimasha noagin, that which we are accustomed, that the custom is to escort a groom when he's leaving shul on Shabbat. And there also is a daughter to be named on Shabbat. The custom is to go with the bride and groom to the baby. And then you continue without the baby to the wedding celebration. hu b'makom kriyat shem de zachar, and the naming of the boys, of the girls, takes place, right, obviously, instead of when you would name a boy, b'shar milah, which happens in the milah, v'tzorach la'agdumei de milah kodem l'chatan, da milah kodem l'meit, umeit kodem l'chatan acher achnasar ha'chuppah. So you should have the milah first, and then the chatan, and then you should have the naming of the girl. So you see already that this is on Shabbat.
Not Ziring. Which turd do you want? There's so many volumes.
It's okay. It's really just to show you the take any volume so I can just show you what it looks like. It's any volume. This is just for visual here. In general, just okay. Yeah. So, thank you. Right. So if you have the tour, right. So in general, in the middle here, this is Shulchan Aruch. Okay. This is both a tour and half of this is Shulchan Aruch, half of this is tour. It's combined. So this is the tour. So here in the middle is what's written by Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim. Then on the inside of the book, meaning towards the binding, this is the Beit Yosef. On the outside is the Bach, or Biol Circus, the Bayit Chadash, also 16th century. The Drisha and the Prisha. The Prisha is the shorter version, the Drisha is the longer one by Rabbi Yeshua Falk Katz. That's over here on the bottom. And in between them is the Darkei Moshe HaKatzar, the abbreviated version of Moshe Israelis' commentary, right? And then, as long as we're here, right? Shulchan Aruch is in the middle. Rabbi Yosef Karo on the side. You'll have super commentaries. You'll have on the inner binding. You have the Taz, Rabbi David Alevi Siegel, the Turi Zahav. On the outer, so it depends. If this is Orach Chaim, so you have Magen Avram, which is Avram Gombiner. On Yeridea, you'll have the Shach, which is the Siftei Kohen, written by Rav Shabtai Kohen Rappaport. And then over here, you'll have the Gra, Rav Eliyahu Kramer of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. 18th century, for anyone who wants an idea, the Gra is a contemporary of George Washington. Right? That's what we're talking. Okay, just if you ever need to think about it, that's what he is. He's late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Right? He's same as George Washington. Okay. I know you don't think about it in those terms. We tend to have like this, American history on one side and Jewish history on the other, but it's important to realize some of these dates. Okay, but that's a little bit just what's on the page here in the Torah. The Drisha is one of the 16th century commentaries. And as we see, right, he already says that the minhag in his time seems to have been to name baby girls on Shabbat. Right, on Shabbat, so the earliest source we have for this is 450 years ago on Shabbat. That's the earliest record we have of this minhag. So we clearly have some minhagim that it's Shabbat, and then we have later minhagim who say it's not really about Shabbat, it's about Kriyat Torah. Okay? So, if I throw it out to you and I say, okay, the first source that we have of this at all is 450 years ago, that it's Shabbat. The first source that we have that it should be Kriyat Torah, maybe on Shabbat, maybe not, is like Hasidic sources, like 200 years ago. So what would you say? How easy is it to, when under pressure, change the minhag? What do you think? Yeah, right? Meaning, right, the more something is a minhag, and the later the minhag, the easier it is to change. So now, let's talk about the realities, right? Why is it that, as much as this is a low-stakes question, why is it that so many people have been asked this question? Like I said, this was the first question I was asked. Why was it so, right? Why is everyone asking it? Because, remember we talked about part of Psak is assessing the issue at hand, the halachic issue. Part of it is assessing the reality, right? Part of it is gauging counter pressures and then weighing everything. So in this case, it's a pretty low-level minhag, which means that how much pressure do you need to change from the minhag, even if you think the minhag is binding in the way that a minhag is? Not so much. So what are the counter pressures here? Let's be straight. What are the counter pressures here? Right? Why would a father of a newborn girl not want to go to shul on Shabbos, get an Aliyah, name the baby there, / get an Aliyah at all? Yeah. What? Good. There's two major reasons. One is family can't come, right? Which is hard, right? Which is a factor because, look, let's be real, right? Traveling for the last 7 months has been difficult, right? It's like it feels like a different world when getting on a plane was easy, right? Like the week before everything shut down, 2 weeks before everything shut down. I don't know if you guys know about Migdal's trip last year. I don't know if you know our big trip last year. Anyways, last year we went to Switzerland as a yeshiva for a few days to CERN, to the International Research Facility, Science Research Facility, where they have the Giant Hadron Collider, nuclear research, and things like that. Don't ask how that came into being, but that was our yeshiva trip last year. It was a lot of fun. It was fascinating. It was so easy. We all just went to the plane. We, we came back from Geneva. We flew into the Zurich airport, I think, to go to Bern and then to Geneva. And then 2 weeks later, travel was a thing of the past. No one travels, right? It's a nightmare to travel, as you know, and it takes quarantine and all that stuff. So one reason is that, look, families can't be there, and it's hard. People want to be part of a simcha, right? People want to be part of a simcha, right? My brother-in-law, business has been booming for him, because what does my brother-in-law do? For years, before it was the only way you could celebrate any simchas, right? He does live stream, high quality live stream for simchas, which was it used to be more of a niche business in Israel for Anglo Olim who their grandparents couldn't come, or some families members didn't come, and for your grandparents, you didn't want to just hold up your phone and FaceTime them into your wedding. You wanted them to at least be able to enjoy it. But the last 6 months, his business has been booming because nobody can come. And if you want to have any simcha, and you want people to come, you want it to be high quality. And, he had to come up with this, add to his repertoire. And now not only does he have it one way, but in certain necessary cases, he puts up screens so it's two-way. So the parents can be not, if they can't attend their kid's wedding, which is terrible enough, right, which sometimes happens, they are projected back here so everyone can talk to, but for a wedding, that's hard, right? For a baby naming, if you can, in some way, allow family to be part of it, because you don't have to do it in shul, and you can have a nice event with your family. So that's one reason that there's pressure, right? That was the reason I got the Shiloh originally, right? Now, what's the second reason why there's this pressure, right? This is the one we all jump to because we're all Anglo in Israel, so we always feel distance, right? But you probably wouldn't have jumped to that right away if you lived in America and your family, and you were currently in America and your family was close, or Israeli and your family was close here. What's the other reason you might not want to get an Aliyah, wait to shul? What's the other pressure? Yes, thank you. I had 2 new babies in the NICU. The last thing I wanted to do was go to shul, right, to get an Aliyah and stand next to somebody, right? Because how far can you be when you get an Aliyah, right? Right? That was the last thing I wanted to do. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to be in bidud, right? Even now, if God forbid I get in bidud, right? I have 1 baby at home. I have 1 baby in the hospital, right? We'll be stuck. I don't want them to be in that. Thank God they're healthy. They're just growing. They're twins. It's normal. This happens, right? And when you're braced for it, it's fine. But the point is, right, if I don't have to get an Aliyah, right, Now look, my community was great, right? The first Thursday after, I didn't name them the morning they were born, even though I actually managed to go to shul in Shari Tzedek that Monday morning, a few hours after I gave birth. In the hospital, I was definitely not getting an Aliyah. That is the last place you want to be standing over someone. I davened Vasikin only because it's the outdoor minyan on a huge porch and there's 15 people on a huge area, but I was not getting near anyone. I stood all on the other side. That was not even a question. But even Thursday, I didn't want to go into shul. I didn't want to get an Aliyah. I don't want to be close to someone. I don't want to be on top of them. Again, my community was great, right? I got a WhatsApp from the Gabbai in shul, Are you comfortable coming to shul? If not, let's make a mishaberach for you, and for your wife, for the babies, and then they send me a video of them saying a mishaberach in shul. They're like, if you can send the names, we'll say it for you. If not, we'll just make a generic one, right? They were great, but I don't want to go into shul, right? So there's a medical reason. So what would you say? You have a reason you don't want to go into shul and get an aliyah and get a mishaberach, whatever, and that's the negative. And on the positive, you want to find some way to get family to participate somehow in a simcha when they can't travel to see their new grandchildren, nieces, right? Whatever, right? Like at this point, it's not even. My kids weren't even the first for my parents. That was the first grandkids in Corona. For my in-laws, right? My brother-in-law had a daughter 6 months ago they haven't seen yet because they're in New York, and driving from Canada to New York right now, you can't drive over the border, right? And they don't want to be going into New York because New York was really bad 6 months ago. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law both had it when she was 9 months pregnant. Like, it was a bad situation, right? There's a lot, coronavirus is all over the place. You don't want to go. So it's hard. So what do you think, right? You're the posting. What do you say? What do you say? What's the calculus? Again, like I said, this is pretty low stakes, but I still, no matter how low stakes the question is, the same factors, looking at the sources, figuring out, is this minhag? If it is a minhag, where does it come from? What's the precedent? How malleable is it? Let's understand the sources. Let's figure out counter pressure. Let's figure out mitzvot, the reality. Is it really dangerous? Is it worth risking it? Right? All those things, all those basic factors. This is a low stakes question, and nevertheless, at a low level, all those factors, here we are analyzing it. So good. Tell me, what do you do? What do you say? Do I have to go into shul to name my children, or can I set up a family Zoom to make people happy, to make them feel like they're part of it, right? To avoid being in shul, to avoid standing over someone in Aliyah. What do you think? Yeah, right? Meaning, right? Like I said, this is low stakes, but I want you to understand that even, right, methodologically, whenever I do any topic, what I said, I want to do topics, but I also each time want to take a few minutes to sort of stand, right, from a bird's eye view and look at it and say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how extreme the question is. In the end of the day, the type of processes a posek goes through are the same. Figure out the source, weigh the different sources, see what different people have said, figure out what type of halacha we're dealing with. Is it d'oraisa? Is it d'rabbanan? Is it minhag? If it's a minhag, how old is it? How new is it? What's the reality on the ground that I have to contend with? What are the, right? And here you have everything. You have an analysis of where does this come from? Oh, it's just a minhag? That means it's going to be more malleable. It's a late minhag? Even better. Right? But then you have the weighing of reality. Is there a danger to go and get an aliyah? Yeah, potentially. Right? That's something you have to take into account. Is there counter pressure? Yes, there's the medical reality, there's the emotional reality, you want your family to be involved, etc. Oh, it's a minhag, pretty easy to change. There are counter pressures, very good. Right? So, that type of calculus, in this case, it's very low stakes. The answer is almost obvious. But just because the answer in this case is pretty much obvious doesn't mean that it's not the same process. Right? It's the same general type of factors that you're weighing. So, one more source. If you look at the Shud Zichron, Yosef, it's another one of the early sources on this. He writes, Masha Noagin, Ba'ashkenaz u'Polin, Shebe Shabbat, Shebe Yom Shabbat Kodesh, Harishon Sholech HaYoled LeBeit HaKnesset, Sheba Lahu Chiyuv La'alot Latzara B'Makom Korban. So, the Drisha is the first source of Shabbat. The Drisha, the Zichron Yosef is the first one who says that it's connected not to Shabbat, but Shabbat because of the Aliyah. Because he claims that when you get an Aliyah, that's sort of like a korban. And therefore you should say, Mishaberach, Mitzvah L'Shas, Latzo, Mishaberach L'Ishto, La'Yeled, V'Agav, Nitparsem Shem Ha'Yeled B'Rabim. And therefore you should say Mishaberach, and that's the way that everyone will learn the name. Hein Zachar Nekeva, V'Noder, Shaval L'Mo'or, and you should give tzedakah. V'Achar Al Pichein Achar Sudat Shacharit Ba'im L'Beit HaYoledet, etc. So here you see the first time for this minhag of the aliyah, and you see that the original minhag includes an aliyah, includes a mishaberach, but that's the minhag. Okay, fine. So as far as I could tell, two poskim were posed with this shaila. One was Rav Shechter, one was Rav Zilberstein. Now, look at Rav Shechter's Shaila, number 7 here. So I do want to point out, remember last week I said that even once you get past Psak, if you want to be a posek, you've got to think not just about the content of your Psak, what do you got to think about? Who are you poskening for? Right? Audience. So, I think that analyzing Rav Shechter's Tshuvot on Corona have been fascinating simply because it's clear when you even look at his Tshuvah, before you even read it visually, right? First, I'll just tell you that this Tshuvah is found online, and the second, I want you just to look at it. Okay? I know I put it in a little bit small, I just wanted to squeeze it in. But even just looking at the Tshuvah, what do you know Rav Shechter is thinking about audience just by looking at it visually before you even read it? What? So first of all, it's younger, and what else? He includes in his audience who? People who are not rabbinically educated enough that they can't read the Hebrew, because he includes translation. This is not my translation, it's right, he included it in the tshuva. Right? And I think even just looking at a tshuva, just looking at it, you know that he thinks his audience are the people who A, are going to be looking online, B, at least part of his audience are people who would appreciate having an English translation and knowing his opinion directly, right? And aren't capable of the Hebrew. And therefore he makes a choice, or whoever publishes Tshuvah makes a choice, that he feels it is valuable to communicate directly, even with the community who's not educated enough to read the original Hebrew, even though it's only like 7 lines. It's not so complicated, right? But again, as a posek, that's a choice, right? It's a choice about your audience. Right, and as I mentioned this to you, I think I mentioned to Shana Bet, that most of Rav Shechter's Tshuvah look like this, right? English and Hebrew. His Tshuvah on triage for ventilators did not have an English translation attached to it. And I think, my guess is that's intentional, because that's a Tshuvah that requires expertise. You don't just throw out a Tshuvah of, here's how you triage ventilators, and let anyone pick it up and read it in Paskin, right? You actively want someone who isn't capable of reading Hebrew to at least consult with a posek before they start deciding how they triage ventilators, right? That's my guess of why that's not translated into English. That's my guess. I don't know. That's my guess. But even just looking at this, you see, he clearly thinks that this tshuva is directly speaking to the Hamonam, even the people who are not able to read the Hebrew, definitely not the Rashi script, and he's okay with that, so he includes an English translation. So here's what he writes. Nagul Omar, the minhag is to say Mishaberach v'lakro labat shem bekesher l'Aliyah l'Torah. The Yesh B'zeh Kama Shinu Minhagim. He says, look, the minhag, when you get an Aliyah, and there's a lot of different minhagim. Im Dafka b'Shabbat HaRishonah, on the first Shabbat, or Afilu b'Mochol b'Sheni v'Chamishi, or even Monday, Thursday. Ayin ba'orech b'Shuvat Minchas Yitzchak, look at the Minchas Yitzchak treatment of this, u'matzav ha'nechachhi she'en lanu kriyat Torah b'tzibur. And nowadays, we don't really have shul, right? Tichulanu atzurim bevatenu bivdidu. Right, this was at the beginning. Everyone's at home. There's no Kriyat Torah anywhere in the world. If you remember those weeks, right, which were really bad, right, all the way back in March. Davar pashut she'en z'ma'akev. So obviously, it's just a minhag. The counter pressure is even greater there. That was when there was no shul. So what are you going to do? Not name your daughter for months on end? We didn't know when it was going to end. Right, it isn't over, but we've given up and have some sort of shul because it's never going to end. This is endless. You're not going to wait till you get out of this danger. He said, all you got to really do is pick a name, start calling her that. That's it. That's her name. He said, even a boy. That minhag is older, so it's harder to push. But let's say, he said, you want proof that that's in the end just a minhag? So many posts can say that if you have a boy who's in danger, or who's really sick and too sick to have a bris, then what do? You give a name before the bris, so that you can daven for the baby. Because in the end of the day, it's only a minhag. So we really don't want to push it. But when there's a real counter pressure, like the baby is really sick, right? Then you do name it before the bris. You can daven. Kadesh, you chalet balel babarok, minhag tshuva, etc. And if you look at the English, right, he says, with regard to the issue of naming a daughter or quarantine in our homes, the usual practice is to name a baby girl after the father receives an aliyah to the Torah. There are several different customs with regard to the specifics of the naming. Some of the custom to wait until Shabbos, while other gives the name on the next Monday or Thursday. In our current predicament, we are unable to have Kriyas HaTorah. The parents should simply decide on a name and begin calling their daughter by that name. And if you look at the next page by Rav Zilberstein, so, okay, if we just do bios here, so Rav Shechter is the senior posek at Yeshiva University. Rav Hershel Schechter lives in Washington Heights. Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein is the leading posek of medical halachic issues. He's posek in Bnei Brak, also current. Right, these are current tshuva written in the last few months. This is from the Sefer Aviyah Chadarav. So he writes, Sheila, b'yamim yeleh shekadosh baruch hu hora lanu lekayim mitzvah nishmartem lo nafshateichem. So remember, we said the pressure here is medical. Right, part of the pressure is medical. You want to avoid shul. She says, so yesh harbe anashim adbalim v'chidut. Right, Rav Schechter was talking about when it was impossible to go to shul. Rav Zilberstein just said, look, there are many people who are just uncomfortable going to shul. Even if there are shuls, they're uncomfortable for good reason, because we're obligated to maintain our health. So we're either davening on the porches of Ein Lem Sefer Torah, and they don't have a Sefer Torah. Just like normally, God wants you to go and daven in shul with a minyan, and hear the Torah. Nowadays, God wants you to be safe. Stay home. We don't serve ourselves, we serve God. No, we do what He wants. I don't know why God wants this to be our avodah, and this to be how we serve God, by keeping ourselves safe and not going to shul, but that's the reality. Right? So here He's outlining for you counter pressure. He's telling you, look, there's a pressure on the table that is pushing me to say that, right, don't try to get a Sefer Torah, don't try to read in shul. This is what I want you to do. So Misha know the lobat. If you have a daughter, and the minhag is for the father to get an Aliyah. So what should you do? Shuvah, his answer is answer, it's a late minhag, it's a late custom. Originally, people used to name it the house anyways. And later on, when the father went to shul, or maybe after 80 days to parallel the karban, like you found in the Zichron, Yosef, then they would have a mishaberach and they would publicize the name. So you should do that too. Formally get your family together, name your child. When you can get an Aliyah eventually, so do it. So, based on these, right, what I decided to do was exactly that. I got a Zoom together, got my family together virtually, right, and some students. You weren't there, you were on your trip, but Shana Bet, I think some Shana Bet joined, and some students didn't go, some friends, and we named the children, right, we named Tamima and Ayala, because for all these reasons, I didn't want to go to shul, I didn't want to get an Aliyah. In the end, afterwards, on Rosh Hashanah, I got an Aliyah outside at our outdoor minyan, and I got maftir. So I was there for 2 seconds, and then when I read the Haftarah, I stood like 20 feet away, right? And, you know, as you can hear, I have a loud voice, so I can project. I can project much louder if I need to. You know, thank God I worked in a shul in Toronto with, you know, over 800 families. I was, you learn to project as much as you need to. The Bayit for, yes, the Bayit. I was one of the rabbis of the Bayit, yes. I would also come to Shar Shemayim, which is also, you also have to reject the Shar Shemayim. The Bayit, trying to think which is, the Bayit,
I think the Bayit is bigger.
the Bayit is bigger, but it's better acoustics. Shar Shemayim's acoustics are a bit harder than Bayit's. Bayit's a very good acoustics. It does, but the acoustics are great to the balcony. To the balcony, they're great. They're bad in the Bayit to the men's section under the balcony, right? Because the balcony stops the sound. So, like the front of the men's section and the balcony are great. The back of the men's section is very, very difficult. You need a really loud voice. Shar Shemayim is much better that way, in that sense. But for the...
I mean, it's also better because it's sound.
What?
It's also better because it's sound.
Yeah. But anyways. Anyways, I lived in Thornhill. My in-laws are from Clanton Park area, you know. But Toronto is a wonderful community. We have nothing bad to say about Toronto. Wonderful community. But this is what we did, right? We felt that because of the medical reasons and because of the emotional reasons, we were going to do a Zoom naming, right? And this is the long answer, right? Which is, again, follow the analysis. The minhag is late, which means it's very little pressure to push it aside. The cost of going to shul, potentially high, medical reasons. The value of dafka not doing it in shul is that you can provide people a certain measure of emotional relief, participation in the simcha. pile those all together, and you get a pretty obvious answer. So bring the whole family together and do a Zoom naming, and then when you get a chance, you'll do a Misha Berach and Shul, right? Whenever that'll be. Happened to be, it was Rosh Hashanah, I didn't expect it, right? But there was a minion on my block. It was pretty safe, right? They gave me maftir, which is 2 psukim. I could stand at a distance and then say Haftarah at an even further distance. So that was what I did. And he says, what's his basis? So if you look at his Mikorot, I'll summarize it. He says, he said the more recent minhag is to do it by Kriyat Torah, but he said that wasn't the original minhag. How does he know? Because the Drisha just talks about Shabbat. That was the Drisha we saw. We can skip that paragraph. We literally read it inside. The original minhag was after davening on Shabbat. You came to the people's house and you had a little party and you named them. That's what they did. So you see that the notion of doing it by Kriyat Torah is so late. The original minhag is not even like that. So you want to do it in your house? Do it in your house. It's great. Then he notes that Shud Zechron Yosef is the one who brings up that in Ashkenaz and Poland the minhag was to do it when you got Kriyat Torah. But even so, right? He said the minhag would be to come to the house eventually, etc. And therefore, he says, skipping down, the minhag is not dafka by Sefer Torah. So name it home, do what you want. Later on, when you get a chance, whenever that is, you'll do a Misha Berach, fine. Right, and he notes the Shever Zecher David, notes Chazal. It doesn't appear in Chazal. So remember we said, you always look at canonical sources. If it doesn't even appear in Chazal, then already you know you're talking a late minhag. You know that you have more flexibility. That the minhag in some places do it where the father gets an Aliyah. But some people always had the minhag to name the day the baby is born. So it sounds like there is no minhag. You dafka need a Sefer Torah. And therefore, if you want, you can do it on the day of birth. For boys, the minhag is by the Bris. He said, but there seems to be a minhag to do it at least when the father is there. Okay, so maybe you'll wait till the father comes. But fundamentally, Rav Zilberstein and Rav Shechter both agree. Right? It doesn't appear in classic sources. It's a minhag, which is more flexible. It's a late minhag, which is even more flexible. There's real counter pressure. Right? They talk mostly about the medical one. Right? I would add that once you have the medical one, you also, there is value, pastorally to find a way to provide people with emotional participation in simchas. So they conclude, then you don't have to do it in shul. And again, like I said, this is a pretty low stakes issue. Right? And yet, you see that it may be low stakes, but poskim go through the exact same process. Is it in Chazal? Not in Chazal. So it's a minhag. Okay, at lower stakes. But even when you're doing minhagim, you look for previous sources, because even on minhag you care about previous authorities. If you remember our 3 prongs, right? So they try to figure out what's the first time it's named. Oh, it's only 500 years ago, and even that minhag is only on Shabbat, and you have to wait another 100 years for it to be Kriyat Torah, and even there's different minhagim. So you see, it's a particularly flexible minhag. Right? So that means that it's not going to take much pressure to go against the minhag, even if ideally I would say keep the minhag. Right? What are the pressures? Oh, medical, emotional, very good. So it's a low-level minhag. There's a lot of good reasons to not follow it in this circumstance, and that's what they did. And that's what they said. Right? It's the same type of cheshbon, it's the same type of calculus. It just happens to be a much lower stakes one. But methodologically, it's the same type of thing. And again, what I want to point out is a meta point, is that, we tend to think that there's like easy psak and then there's high stakes psak, and that's true. What I want you to understand is that basically the fundamental processes are the same, whether it's low stakes or high stakes. And when we talk about contemporary halacha, right, and you just have to remember that the fundamental rule is that halacha, especially practical halacha, is the interface between theoretical law and reality. And therefore, just like in everything in life, right, there are little things that are affected and big things that are affected by reality, right? By changes in our world. Halacha is going to be the exact same. And therefore you should expect that if the world is trying to figure out everything from how do I deal with saving people's lives, which are the big stakes things, to how do I keep myself sane while my kids aren't at school, right? I need to keep them occupied, right? Then halacha is going to be dealing with the big stakes things, triage and ventilators and stuff like that, to the little things, which are, how do I celebrate when when we're isolated and we can't go along a normal schedule? How do I find ways of celebrating the happy times in life? Because halacha is a reflection of life. So in every way that life changes, halacha is going to respond as well. Okay? Like I said, the primary motivation here was that, it was part of my own sort of simcha was just to go through it and think about it, because, like I said, I've gotten used to the Bris naming thing and all the pressure that goes with Brises and whatever, and thinking about it with girls was different. So I wanted to think about it and think about it through Torah as well. So I figured I would share it. I didn't know how much time it would take, so at the end I found another tshuva. I figured I would just do it. We don't have time, but some reading material for you. It was a fascinating tshuva I happened to come across, which is a totally different thing, which is a bit more depressing, but it's a fascinating question on whether halacha recognizes the reality of trauma, and whether an employer who employee was infected has to not only pay for their medical expenses, but has to recognize the reality of psychological damage and pay for therapy. And is that something halacha recognizes? And how does halacha? Which is a fascinating question. I put it there in case we had time. You can read it over Chag. It's an interesting tshuva. I happen to like it. I got to think about it a little bit more.